I never thought silence could be so loud. But that night, when my phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m. with those 7 words that would shatter my world, I learned that some silences scream louder than any argument ever could. Don't ever call me again. I stared at the message until my eyes burned, reading it over and over, hoping the letters would somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Something that didn't feel like a death sentence delivered in 12-point font on a screen that suddenly felt heavier than lead in my trembling hands. My son, my Alejandro, the boy I carried for 9 months, nursed through countless sleepless nights, held when nightmares made him cry, cheered for at every soccer game even when I was dead tired from my double shifts at the diner. The young man I sacrificed everything for, including my own dreams, my own happiness, my own sense of who I was beyond being his mother, just gone. With a text message, I sat there on my worn-out couch, the same couch where I'd rocked him to sleep as a baby, where we'd watched cartoons on Saturday mornings, where I'd helped him with homework while my own back ached from standing on my feet for 14 hours straight serving coffee to people who barely looked at me. The fabric was faded now, threadbare in places where our life had worn it thin, but it held our memories. At least I thought it did. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, shaking like autumn leaves. Should I call him? Should I demand an explanation? Should I beg? For 28 years, I'd been his mother. 28 years of putting him first, of making sure he never felt the abandonment I'd felt when his father walked out on us when Alejandro was only 3. 28 years of being everything: mother, father, provider, protector, cheerleader, and safe harbor. And now, in 7 words, I was nothing. I typed back the only thing my dignity would allow. Got your message, child. Send. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of questions that clawed at my chest, full of memories that now felt like lies, full of a pain so deep I couldn't even find tears for it. I just sat there, feeling something fundamental shift inside me, like a foundation cracking under too much weight carried for too long. The apartment felt different immediately. Smaller, emptier. Every corner held echoes of him, his baby shoes still in my closet, his graduation photo on the mantelpiece, the coffee mug he'd bought me for Mother's Day 3 years ago that said "World's Best Mom" in letters that now felt like mockery. I walked to the kitchen and put on water for tea, my hands moving automatically while my mind spun in circles. What had I done wrong? When had I lost him? Was it when I couldn't afford to send him to the expensive college he wanted? Was it when I remarried briefly to give him a father figure, only to divorce again when the man turned out to be nothing like what Alejandro needed? Was it because I worked too much, trying to provide for us? Or because I didn't work enough to give him everything he wanted? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, each one more painful than the last. I thought about calling my sister Carmen, but I could already hear her voice. Maria, you spoiled that boy. You gave him everything and asked for nothing back. What did you expect? Carmen had always been the practical one, the one who said the hard truths nobody wanted to hear. But tonight, I couldn't bear to hear them. Instead, I sat at my small kitchen table with my cup of chamomile tea, the same table where Alejandro had eaten thousands of meals I'd prepared with love, where I'd helped him with school projects, where we'd talked about his dreams and fears and everything in between. The wood was scarred from years of use, marked with ring stains from countless mugs and small burns from hot pots I'd set down too quickly when rushing to get to work. If you're watching this story and feeling something in your chest tighten, if you're thinking about your own children or the love you've given that sometimes feels unappreciated, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything. Comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I read every single one. The night stretched endlessly ahead of me. I tried to remember the last conversation we'd had. It was 3 weeks ago, when he'd called asking for money for his car repair. I'd sent it immediately, of course, even though it meant eating ramen noodles for the rest of the month. He'd thanked me, said he loved me, promised to call soon, and then, nothing, until tonight's message. I pressed my palms against my eyes, feeling the weight of 55 years settling on my shoulders like a heavy coat I couldn't take off. When had I become this woman? This woman who lived entirely through her child, who had no identity beyond Alejandro's mother, who had forgotten what she wanted for herself because wanting things for him had become her entire existence. The truth was bitter as medicine. I'd been so afraid of losing him that I'd lost myself, and somehow, in losing myself, I'd lost him anyway. I looked around my quiet apartment, really looked at it for the first time in years. When had it become so small? When had the walls started closing in? When had my own life become something I was just passing through on the way to his? The silence wasn't just coming from my phone anymore. It was coming from inside me, from the place where my own voice used to live before I learned to speak only in worried questions about his happiness, his needs, his future. But as I sat there in the dim light of my kitchen, something unexpected began to grow in that silence. Not acceptance. I wasn't ready for that yet. Not understanding. That might never come. But something else. Something that felt like possibility. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just an ending. Maybe it was also a beginning. The signs had been there for months, but I'd been too desperate to keep us together to see them clearly. Now, sitting in the wreckage of that text message, the memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. All the moments I'd explained away, all the coldness I'd excused, all the distance I'd pretended wasn't growing between us. It started with the phone calls getting shorter. Where we used to talk for an hour about everything and nothing, suddenly our conversations became transactions. He needed money for rent. He needed advice about his job. He needed me to co-sign something. Always needing, never just wanting to hear my voice. "Mom, I can't talk long," became his standard greeting. "I'm busy," became his standard goodbye. I told myself he was just stressed, just overwhelmed with adult life. I made excuses for him the way I'd made excuses for his father all those years ago. Another pattern I was too close to see. Then came the missed holidays. First, it was Thanksgiving. "I'm working, Mom. You understand, right?" Of course I understood. I always understood. I spent that day alone, cooking a small turkey anyway because the ritual felt important, even if the audience had disappeared. I packaged up leftovers he'd never come to collect. Christmas was next. "I'm going to Sarah's family this year," he said, referring to his girlfriend I'd met exactly twice. "Her parents really want me there." The way he said it made it clear that what her parents wanted mattered more than what I might want. I hung tiny ornaments on a small tree and tried to convince myself that being alone was peaceful, not pathetic. My birthday in February was the breaking point I should have recognized. I'd hinted for weeks about maybe having dinner together, just the two of us, like we used to when he was younger, and birthdays meant homemade cake and silly presents he'd made in art class. "I'll try to make it work, Mom," he said. But the way he said it, like he was doing me a favor, like my birthday was an inconvenience to be managed rather than a moment we might actually want to share, should have told me everything I needed to know. He didn't show up, didn't call until 3 days later with an apology that sounded rehearsed and hollow. "Sorry, Mom. Work was crazy. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was, because he never told me about his work anymore. He never told me about anything anymore. I spent that birthday evening at my kitchen table with a store-bought cupcake and a single candle, feeling foolish and forgotten. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door heard me crying through the thin walls and brought over some of her homemade flan, sitting with me for an hour while I pretended everything was fine. "Mija," she said gently, "sometimes our children have to find their own way, but that doesn't mean they stop needing us. Just differently." I nodded and smiled and thanked her for the flan, but inside I was screaming, how differently? How long? How much distance was too much? The worst part wasn't his absence. It was how other people started noticing. Carmen, my sister, began asking pointed questions. "Where's Alejandro these days? Haven't seen him around." When I made excuses, she'd raise her eyebrow in that way that said she knew exactly what was happening, but was too polite to say it directly. At the diner where I worked, my coworkers stopped asking about him. For years, they'd listened to my proud updates. His new job, his apartment, his girlfriend, his plans. I was the mother who couldn't stop talking about her successful son. But when the updates stopped coming because there were no more calls to provide them, the silence became obvious to everyone. "How's that boy of yours?" old Mr. Peterson would ask when he came in for his Tuesday coffee. I learned to deflect with vague responses. "Oh, you know how busy young people are these days." But I could see the pity creeping into people's eyes. The recognition that something had shifted in the story I'd been telling about my perfect relationship with my child. The breaking point came at Easter. I'd bought ingredients for his favorite meal, the elaborate Sunday dinner I used to make when he was growing up, complete with the tres leches cake that took me hours to prepare perfectly. I'd texted him about it, casual but hopeful, making your favorite dinner Sunday if you want to come by. His response came 6 hours later. Can't make it, already have plans. Not, I wish I could. Not, maybe next time. Not even, sorry. Just, can't make it. Like I was a casual acquaintance he was politely declining, not the woman who'd raised him single-handedly for 25 years. I stared at that message for a long time, sitting in my living room surrounded by grocery bags full of food I'd bought to show love to someone who apparently no longer wanted it. The tres leches cake ingredients seemed to mock me from the counter. Eggs and milk and sweetened condensed milk. All the components of something that required time and care and faith that someone would appreciate the effort. I cooked it all anyway. Not for him. He'd made it clear he wouldn't be there. But because throwing it away felt like admitting defeat in a way I wasn't ready for yet. I ate alone at the table set for two, his empty chair a stark reminder of how long I'd been having conversations with a ghost. That's when I started to understand something painful but necessary. I'd been loving someone who had already left. Physically, he lived across town. Emotionally, he'd moved to another planet, one where mothers were optional rather than essential, where the woman who'd sacrificed everything for him had become just another obligation to be managed and eventually discarded. The realization didn't come all at once. It crept up on me like age itself, slowly, then suddenly, until one day I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. When had I become this person who waited by the phone? When had I started measuring my worth by how often my own child chose to include me in his life? Sarah, his girlfriend, became another source of subtle pain. The few times I'd met her, she was polite but distant, treating me like Alejandro's embarrassing relative rather than the woman who'd shaped everything good about him. She never asked me questions about his childhood, never seemed curious about the stories that had made him who he was. To her, his life began when she entered it. Your mom seems nice, I overheard her tell him once when they were leaving my apartment after a brief, awkward visit. The pause before nice told me everything I needed to know about how he'd been describing me to her. Not as the woman who'd worked 2 jobs to pay for his college, not as the person who'd driven him to every soccer practice and stayed to cheer from the sidelines. Just nice. A harmless old woman who happened to share his DNA. I began to feel like I was disappearing, becoming invisible in my own son's story. The woman who'd been the most important person in his world had become a footnote, a barely tolerated reminder of a past he was apparently eager to leave behind. But even as I felt myself fading from his life, something else was growing stronger inside me. A quiet voice I hadn't heard in years was beginning to whisper questions I'd been afraid to ask. Who was I before I became his mother? What did I want for myself? Not for him. What would my life look like if I stopped waiting for him to remember that he loved me? The answers were terrifying, but they were also, I was beginning to realize, mine to discover. I tried everything to bridge the growing chasm between us. Looking back now, I can see how desperate I must have seemed, how pathetic my attempts to claw my way back into his affections appeared to anyone watching. But when you're drowning, you grab onto anything, even if it's pulling you deeper underwater. I started sending care packages, boxes filled with his favorite cookies, the kind I used to bake when he was stressed about exams. I'd spend entire weekends measuring ingredients, rolling dough, decorating each cookie with the same love I'd poured into them when he was 10 years old. I'd pack them carefully in containers that wouldn't let them break, write little notes about how proud I was of him, how much I missed him. The first package, he acknowledged with a brief text, "Thanks for the cookies." The second got no response at all. By the third, I realized I was sending love letters to someone who had changed his address and forgotten to tell me. I tried showing up at his apartment with homemade meals. I made too much, I'd lie, standing at his door with containers of rice and beans, the comfort food that had sustained us through his childhood. The first time, he let me in for 20 minutes, ate politely while checking his phone, and thanked me with the same tone he'd use for a pizza delivery guy. The second time, he answered the door but didn't invite me in. "I'm actually about to go out, Mom," he said, taking the containers but already stepping back. "Thanks for bringing this." The door closed before I could ask where he was going, or if maybe I could wait for him to come back. The third time, he didn't answer the door at all, even though I could hear the television playing inside and see the shadow of his feet moving past the window. I stood there for 10 minutes, knocking softly, calling his name, feeling like a beggar asking for scraps of my own child's attention. Finally, I left the food by his door and drove home with tears I couldn't stop, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I joined Facebook, something I'd resisted for years, just to feel connected to his life somehow. I learned to navigate the confusing interface, posting cheerful messages on his wall about how proud I was of him, how much I loved him, how I hoped we could get together soon. But his responses, when they came at all, were brief and formal. "Thanks, Mom. Nothing more." Worse was watching him interact with other people online. He'd have long, animated conversations with friends, post photos of dinners out and weekend trips, share jokes and memories with people who apparently mattered more than the woman who'd given him life. I'd see photos of him at barbecues and birthday parties, smiling wider than I'd seen him smile in years, surrounded by people who weren't me. Sarah posted pictures constantly of their date nights, their weekend getaways, their couple's adventures. In every photo, Alejandro looked relaxed and happy in a way I couldn't remember seeing when he was with me. It was like watching my son live a parallel life where I didn't exist, where happiness was possible only in my absence. The most painful posts were the ones about her family. "Such a wonderful evening with the Johnsons," she'd write, posting photos of elaborate family dinners where Alejandro sat at their table like he belonged there, like he was their son instead of mine. Her mother would comment with heart emojis and inside jokes. Her father would make proud comments about what a great young man Alejandro was. Where were their comments when he graduated college? Where were their encouragements when he was struggling to find his first job? Where were they during the nights when he called me crying about his anxiety, when I stayed up until dawn talking him through his fears? They got the polished, successful version of him. I'd gotten the scared, struggling, real version. And apparently that was no longer needed. I tried calling her parents once, thinking maybe if I could connect with them, we could all be one big extended family. Her mother was polite but cool. "Oh yes, you're Alejandro's mother. He's mentioned you. Mentioned me. Like I was an acquaintance from work rather than the person who'd shaped everything good about him. I was hoping maybe we could all have dinner together sometime," I said, hating how hopeful I sounded. How much I was begging for inclusion in my own son's life. "I'd love to get to know you better." "That's sweet," she said, with a pause that told me exactly how unlikely that dinner was to happen. "Our schedule is pretty packed these days, but we'll definitely keep it in mind." We never spoke again. The comparisons started slowly, so subtly I almost missed them at first. Sarah would post about her family's vacations to Europe, their elegant dinner parties, their country club memberships. Then Alejandro started making comments, not directly critical, but pointed enough to sting. "Sarah's mom is amazing," he told me during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "She's so organized, so put together. She runs this whole charity foundation and still manages to cook these incredible meals for their family dinners every Sunday." I thought about my own Sunday dinners, the ones he'd stopped coming to, the ones I'd cooked for an empty chair for months before finally giving up. "That sounds wonderful," I managed to say, swallowing the hurt. "Yeah, and her dad is so successful. He's really smart about investments and business. He's been giving me advice about my career." The implication was clear. Unlike my advice, which apparently wasn't valuable enough to seek any more. During one particularly painful conversation, he said something that cut deeper than any deliberate insult could have. "You know, Mom, Sarah's family they have their lives figured out. They don't stress about money all the time. They don't make everything so complicated." Complicated. That's what our relationship had become to him, an unnecessary complication in a life that could be simpler without me. 28 years of love, sacrifice, and devotion, reduced to a problem that needed solving. The final humiliation came at his birthday. I'd asked weeks in advance if I could take him to dinner, just the two of us, like we used to do. He'd been non-committal, saying he wasn't sure what his plans were yet. I waited, hoping, checking my phone for invitations that never came. Instead, I found out about his birthday party through Facebook. Photos posted in real time of a surprise party Sarah had organized. All his friends were there, her family was there, even some of his co-workers I'd never met. There was a beautiful cake, elaborate decorations, thoughtful gifts, and joy. So much joy that didn't include me. I'd spent his birthday evening alone in my apartment, holding the gift I'd bought him, a watch with an inscription about time being precious, about love lasting forever. Stupid, sentimental words that meant nothing to someone who'd already decided his mother was optional. I kept that watch in my drawer for weeks, unable to return it but unwilling to give it to someone who'd made it clear that my presence at his celebration wasn't wanted. It became a symbol of everything I'd lost, not just my son, but my place in his story, my role in his happiness, my value in his life. The worst part wasn't the exclusion itself, it was the casual cruelty of it. The way I'd been erased so thoroughly that he hadn't even thought to feel guilty about it. I wasn't worth lying to anymore. I wasn't important enough to hurt deliberately. I was just nothing. That night, looking at those party photos, seeing my son surrounded by people who apparently loved him better than I ever could, I finally understood something that should have been obvious months earlier. I wasn't fighting for his love anymore. I was fighting for my own dignity, and I was losing both battles. But deep inside, in a place that had been quiet for too long, something was stirring. Not anger, not yet, but something harder to ignore. The recognition that I deserved better than this. Even from him. Especially from him. The breaking point came on Mother's Day. The one day I'd foolishly believed would be sacred, untouchable, immune to the cold war my son had been waging against my heart. I woke up that morning with the pathetic hope that blooms eternal in mothers' hearts. Checking my phone immediately for the message that would prove I still mattered. Nothing. I made coffee and waited. Checked again. Still nothing. The morning stretched into afternoon, each hour marking another small death of expectation. By evening, I was sitting at my kitchen table staring at the phone like it might spontaneously develop the ability to care about my feelings. The same table where he'd made me construction paper cards with crooked hearts and misspelled I love yous when he was little. The same table where I'd taught him to write his name, where we'd done homework together, where he'd told me about his first heartbreak, and I'd held his hands while he cried. That table had witnessed so much love. Now it was just a piece of furniture in an apartment where Mother's Day passed unacknowledged. I called Carmen finally, needing to hear another human voice before the silence drove me completely insane. "Happy Mother's Day, Hermana," she said gently, and I could hear in her tone that she already knew why I was calling. "He didn't call," I whispered, the words scraping my throat raw. "He didn't even send a text." The pause on the other end lasted forever. When Carmen spoke again, her voice carried 20 years of watching me pour myself out for a child who'd learned to take it for granted. "Maria, mi amor, when are you going to stop waiting for him to remember that you exist?" "He's my son," I said, the phrase that had been my identity, my excuse, my reason for everything for so long that I didn't know who I was without it. "And you're a person," Carmen replied. "You were a person before he was born, and you're still a person now that he's decided you don't matter. When are you going to start acting like it?" After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, not bothering to turn on the lights. The shadows felt appropriate for the landscape of my heart. I thought about all the Mother's Days when he was young, how he'd wake me up with breakfast in bed that was more love than skill, how he'd present his handmade gifts with such pride, how he'd spend the whole day making sure I felt special. Where was that boy now? When had he been replaced by this stranger who could let Mother's Day pass like any other Sunday, who could ignore the woman who'd made his existence possible with the same casual indifference he'd show to junk mail? I walked through my apartment in the dark, touching things that held memories, the photo of his first day of school, his soccer trophies, the Father's Day card he'd made me when he was 8 because, "You're my mom and my dad." Each item felt like evidence from a crime scene. Proof that love had once lived here before being murdered by neglect and replacement. In my bedroom, I opened the drawer where I kept his letters from summer camp, his report cards, the hospital bracelet from when he was born. 28 years of documentation that I'd mattered to someone, that my love had been welcomed, treasured, reciprocated. Now these papers felt like artifacts from an ancient civilization, fascinating to archaeologists, but utterly irrelevant to the world that existed now. I pulled out the Mother's Day cards he'd given me over the years, reading his childish handwriting. "You're the best mom in the world. I love you more than ice cream. Thank you for taking care of me when I'm sick." Each card was signed with elaborate hearts and smiley faces, evidence of a boy who couldn't imagine loving anyone more than his mother. That boy was gone. Maybe he'd died gradually, killed by the normal process of growing up and growing away. Or maybe he'd been murdered by a woman who convinced him that his history was embarrassing, that his modest beginnings were something to hide, that the love that had sustained him for decades was now an inconvenience to be managed. I held those cards against my chest and finally cried. Not the angry tears of earlier months, but something deeper. Grief. Pure, undiluted grief for a relationship that had died without last rites, for a love that had been buried without ceremony, for a son who'd learned to live as if his mother had never existed. The next week brought a moment that should have been triumphant, but instead became the final nail in the coffin of my hope. Alejandro got promoted at work, a significant advancement he'd been working toward for months. I only found out through Facebook, where Sarah posted a celebration photo of them at an expensive restaurant, champagne glasses raised, her caption gushing about how proud she was of her man. I stared at that photo for an hour. My son, celebrating the biggest professional achievement of his life, surrounded by people who'd known him for 2 years, while the woman who'd believed in him for 28 years learned about it through social media like a stranger. I thought about all the times I'd stayed up late helping him with job applications, reviewing his resume, practicing interview questions with him. I thought about the phone calls where he'd doubted himself, and I'd reminded him of his strengths, his intelligence, his worthiness. I thought about the sacrifices I'd made to pay for his education, the foundation that had made this promotion possible. None of that mattered now. In his moment of triumph, I was as relevant as the waitress who'd served their champagne. That's when something inside me finally cracked. Not broke, because broken things can be fixed. This was different. This was the sound of hope dying, of faith dissolving, of a mother's heart finally accepting what her mind had been trying to tell her for months. I was alone. Not alone in the world. There were still people who cared about me, who valued my friendship, who appreciated my presence. But alone in the specific way that only a parent can understand. The child I'd loved more than my own life had decided I was disposable. I stopped checking my phone obsessively, stopped crafting casual texts that might prompt responses, stopped planning conversations in my head, imagining scenarios where he'd remember how much he used to love me. I stopped performing the exhausting daily ritual of hope and disappointment that had become my existence. For the first time in months, maybe years, I looked around my apartment and saw it clearly. When had it become a shrine to someone who no longer worshipped here? When had I turned my home into a museum of a relationship that existed now only in my memory? I walked to my bedroom mirror and really looked at myself, not checking my appearance for potential criticism, not cataloging my flaws the way I'd learned to do when his indifference made me wonder what was wrong with me, just looking. What I saw was a 55-year-old woman who'd forgotten she had value beyond her usefulness to someone else. My hair had grown longer than I usually kept it, not because I liked it that way, but because I'd been too focused on his absence to pay attention to my own preferences. My clothes were practical, chosen for affordability rather than beauty, as if I'd decided I didn't deserve to feel attractive since the most important person in my life had stopped seeing me altogether. But in the mirror, underneath the weariness and grief, I caught a glimpse of something I'd forgotten existed. The woman I'd been before I became defined entirely by motherhood. The woman who'd had dreams of her own before they all became about making his dreams possible. The woman who'd been enough, all by herself, before she learned to measure her worth by someone else's approval. I touched my reflection and whispered words I hadn't said in decades. You deserve better than this. It wasn't anger yet. It wasn't strength yet. It wasn't the fierce determination that would come later. But it was something. A tiny ember in the ashes of everything I thought I'd lost. And for the first time in months, instead of waiting for someone else to decide I was worth loving, I considered the revolutionary possibility that maybe I was worth loving whether he remembered it or not. Maybe I still had something left, something that belonged entirely to me, something he'd forgotten but couldn't take away. Maybe this wasn't just an ending. Maybe, if I was brave enough to let go of who I'd been, it could be a beginning too. Something shifted in me after that night at the mirror. Not dramatically. There were no lightning bolts or sudden revelations. It was quieter than that. Like the way seasons change without you noticing until one day you realize the air smells different and the light falls at a new angle. I stopped waiting for my phone to ring. It sounds simple, But for someone who'd spent months organizing her entire emotional life around the possibility of contact, it was revolutionary. I put the phone in a drawer during meals. I stopped carrying it from room to room like a lifeline. I began to move through my days without the constant background hum of hope and dread that had been the soundtrack to my existence. The silence in my apartment changed too. Before, it had felt empty, like a theater after the audience leaves. Now it began to feel peaceful, mine. I could hear my own thoughts without them being drowned out by the constant mental chatter of worry about him, plans to reach him, strategies to win him back. I started remembering things I'd forgotten about myself. Small things at first. How I used to love reading mystery novels late into the night. How I'd always been good with plants. How I actually enjoyed cooking when it was for my own pleasure, rather than desperate attempts to earn someone's love. These memories felt like artifacts from an archaeological dig, evidence of a person who'd existed before I became consumed with being the perfect mother to an increasingly imperfect son. Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on my door one evening with a cutting from her prize-winning hibiscus plant. "I thought you might like to try growing this," she said, holding out the small pot with shy pride. "You always admired it when you walked by." I had admired it. I'd forgotten that I'd even mentioned it to her months ago, back when I still made small talk with neighbors instead of rushing past them to get home and check for messages that never came. The cutting was tiny but healthy, with bright green leaves that seemed to pulse with potential. "I don't know much about plants," I told her, though even as I said it, I remembered how my mother used to keep a garden, how I'd helped her as a child, learning the names of flowers and the rhythm of seasons. "Plants are forgiving," Mrs. Rodriguez said with a knowing smile. "More forgiving than people sometimes. They don't ask for much, just attention, water, light. And they give back more than you'd expect." I placed the hibiscus cutting on my kitchen windowsill and found myself checking on it several times a day, not with the desperate anxiety I'd brought to checking my phone, but with gentle curiosity. Would it grow? Would it bloom? What would it need from me? And what might it give back? That tiny plant became my first act of faith in something other than my son's eventual return to loving me. I bought plant food, researched hibiscus care online, even found myself at the garden center on Saturday mornings, asking questions and learning about soil and fertilizer and the delicate balance required to help something flourish. The garden center became an unexpected refuge. The elderly man who ran it, Mr. Chen, treated everyone who walked through his doors like they were capable of miracles, just by virtue of wanting to help something grow. He never asked why a middle-aged woman was suddenly interested in plants, never commented on the fact that I sometimes stood among the flowers for an hour without buying anything, just breathing in the earthy smell of growth and possibility. "Every plant knows what it needs," he told me one afternoon as I debated between two small succulents. "The trick is learning to listen to them instead of deciding for them what they should want." His words hit me in a place I wasn't expecting. How long had I been deciding what Alejandro should want from me instead of listening to what he was actually telling me? How long had I been forcing my love on someone who'd clearly outgrown the container I'd built for our relationship? I bought both succulents and added them to my growing collection. My apartment started to change. Slowly but perceptibly. Green things appeared on surfaces that had been empty. The air smelled fresher. Light seemed brighter as it filtered through leaves that hadn't been there before. But the real change was happening inside me. I started paying attention to my own preferences again, making tiny choices based on what I wanted rather than what might impress or attract or appease someone else. I bought coffee I actually liked instead of the brand that was on sale. I rearranged my furniture to face the window instead of the television, because I realized I preferred watching the world outside to watching other people's stories unfold on screens. I enrolled in a pottery class at the community center, something I'd wanted to try for years but had never pursued because there was always something Alejandro needed. Some way his life required my attention, more than my own interests deserved consideration. The class met Thursday evenings, and for 2 hours a week, I focused entirely on the clay in my hands, the wheel spinning beneath my fingers, the small miracle of creating something from nothing. "Pottery is honest," said Elena, our instructor, a woman in her 70s whose hands moved across clay like she was reading Braille. "It responds to pressure, but only the right kind. Too much force and it collapses. Too little and it never takes shape. You have to find the balance between holding on and letting go." I was terrible at first. My bowls lopsided, my mugs more like abstract sculptures than functional objects. But there was something deeply satisfying about working with my hands, about creating something that belonged entirely to me. My pieces might not be beautiful, but they were mine in a way nothing had been for a very long time. In the class, I met other women who'd found themselves with unexpected free time. Widows, empty nesters, divorcees, women who'd spent decades defining themselves through relationships that had ended or evolved, or simply grown too small to contain who they were becoming. We didn't talk much about our personal lives, but there was an understanding among us, a recognition of shared experience without the need for detailed explanation. Sarah, a woman near my age whose husband had left her for his secretary, created the most beautiful vases, her movements confident and sure despite having started pottery only weeks before I did. "I used to think I wasn't creative," she told me one evening as we cleaned our tools. "Turns out I just never had time to find out what I was good at when I was busy trying to be good at being what someone else needed." Her words stayed with me as I walked home that night, my hands still dirty with clay dust, my mind quiet in a way it hadn't been for months. I stopped at the mirror in my hallway, the same mirror where I'd whispered that I deserved better, and looked at myself again. This time, I didn't see a woman waiting for someone to remember she existed. I saw someone who was slowly, carefully, remembering herself. The hibiscus cutting had grown. 3 new leaves had unfurled in the past week, reaching toward the light with the kind of determination I was beginning to recognize in myself. It hadn't bloomed yet, but I could see the tiny buds forming, the promise of flowers that would come in their own time, when the plant was ready, regardless of my impatience or expectations. I touched one of the new leaves gently and realized something profound. I was no longer waiting for Alejandro to water my roots. I was learning to tend my own garden. That night, for the first time in months, I didn't think about him before falling asleep. Instead, I thought about the pottery class, about the plants growing stronger each day, about the woman I was becoming in the space his absence had created. It wasn't anger yet. That would come later. It wasn't revenge or bitterness or the need to prove anything to anyone. It was something much more powerful and much more dangerous to the version of myself I'd been clinging to for so long. It was indifference to his approval and growing fascination with my own. The transformation wasn't visible to most people at first. I moved through my days with the same quiet efficiency I'd always had, worked my shifts at the diner with the same professional courtesy, smiled at neighbors with the same warmth. But underneath, something fundamental was shifting, like tectonic plates moving slowly toward an inevitable earthquake. I started a journal, something I'd never done before, having always been too busy managing other people's lives to examine my own. At first, I didn't know what to write. 28 years of measuring my days by someone else's needs and moods had left me surprisingly unfamiliar with my own inner landscape. But gradually, words came. Small observations at first, how the morning light looked different when I wasn't rushing to check my phone, how coffee tasted better when I drank it slowly, how silence could be companionship rather than abandonment. "Today I realized I haven't cried in a week," I wrote one evening, the words surprising me even as my pen formed them. Not because I'm not sad anymore, but because the sadness has become something else, something that belongs to me instead of controlling me. The pottery was getting better. My hands had learned the rhythm of the wheel, the pressure needed to shape clay without crushing it. Elena noticed my progress and suggested I try something more challenging, a large bowl that would require multiple sessions to complete. "You're developing patience," she observed, watching me work. "That's the hardest thing to teach. Most people want immediate results, but the best pieces take time to emerge." I thought about her words as I shaped the clay, feeling it respond to my touch with increasing trust. How long had I been rushing through life, demanding immediate responses to my love, immediate gratitude for my sacrifices, immediate acknowledgement of my worth? How long had I been trying to force relationships into shapes that couldn't sustain the pressure I was applying? The bowl took 3 weeks to complete. Each session, I added a little more height, refined the curves, smoothed the imperfections. When it was finally ready for the kiln, I felt a pride that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. It was mine. I had made it with my own hands, my own vision, my own patience. Carmen noticed the change first. We were having lunch at our usual cafe when she stopped mid-sentence and stared at me with a puzzled expression. "What's different about you?" she asked, Her head tilted like she was trying to solve a riddle. Different how? I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. I felt different. Lighter somehow. Like I'd been carrying a heavy bag for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to walk unburdened. I don't know, calmer? You're not checking your phone every 5 minutes. You're not mentioning Alejandro every other sentence. She paused, studying my face. When's the last time you talked to him? I haven't, I said simply. And I'm not going to. Carmen's eyebrows shot up. What do you mean you're not going to? He's your son. He's a grown man who's made it clear he doesn't want his mother in his life, I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I'm respecting his choice. But Maria, no buts, I interrupted gently. I spent months chasing someone who was running away from me. I'm done chasing. The conversation made me realize how much I'd changed without consciously deciding to change. The desperate, pleading woman who'd sent unanswered care packages and stood outside locked doors was becoming someone else. Someone who understood the difference between loving someone and allowing them to destroy you in the name of that love. At work, my coworkers began commenting on my new energy. You seem happier lately, said Rosa, the young waitress who'd watched me struggle through months of obvious heartbreak. Did you and your son work things out? No, I said, refilling the coffee station with movements that had become meditation. But I worked something out with myself. The regular customers noticed too. Mr. Peterson, who'd been coming to the diner for 15 years, mentioned that I seemed more present lately. You always were the best waitress here, he said. But lately you seem like you actually want to be here instead of wishing you were somewhere else. He was right. For the first time in years, I wasn't mentally elsewhere during my shifts, wasn't constantly distracted by thoughts of what Alejandro might be doing or feeling or needing. I was fully inhabiting my own life, paying attention to the customers who appreciated my service, enjoying conversations with coworkers who'd always been kind to me, but whom I'd never really seen because my emotional energy was constantly focused elsewhere. I started reading again, real books, not just the mindless scrolling through social media that had become my substitute for genuine engagement with ideas. I rediscovered my love for mystery novels, staying up late to finish stories about people who solved problems and found answers and emerged victorious despite overwhelming odds. The characters in these books reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that protagonists don't spend their entire stories waiting for other people to rescue them. They take action. They make choices. They determine their own fates instead of hoping someone else will finally decide they're worthy of love. One evening, while organizing my bookshelf, something I'd neglected for months, I found a letter I'd written to Alejandro years earlier but never sent. It was from a period when he was struggling in college, doubting himself, calling me in tears about how difficult everything was. The letter was full of encouragement, reminders of his strength, stories about how proud I was of his persistence. Reading it now, I was struck by how clearly I'd seen his worth even when he couldn't see it himself. How patiently I'd reminded him of his value when he was ready to give up. How much wisdom I'd offered about weathering difficult times and trusting in his own resilience. Where was that voice now when I needed it? Where was the woman who could see someone's strength so clearly, who could offer such gentle wisdom about persistence and self-worth? Why had I been able to love him through his darkness, but not extend the same compassion to myself through mine? I sat down that night and wrote myself a letter. The kind of letter I would have written to a friend going through what I'd been experiencing, full of the gentle encouragement and clear-eyed wisdom I'd always been able to offer everyone except myself. Dear Maria, I began, you are not responsible for someone else's inability to appreciate your love. You are not required to keep pouring yourself out for people who've made it clear they don't want what you're offering. You are allowed to save some of your compassion for yourself. Writing those words felt like coming home to a part of myself I'd abandoned somewhere along the way. The woman who'd raised a child single-handedly, who'd worked multiple jobs without complaint, who'd sacrificed her own dreams to make someone else's possible. That woman was strong. That woman was capable. That woman deserved better than to spend her days begging for crumbs of affection from someone who'd decided she wasn't worth a full meal. I folded the letter and put it in my journal, next to pressed flowers from my plants and sketches of pottery pieces I wanted to try. It became a physical reminder of something I was learning to believe again, that I was worth the effort I'd been putting into everyone else. The hibiscus finally bloomed, a perfect red flower that lasted only a day, but was so beautiful while it lived that Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on my door just to tell me she'd seen it from her window. "Some flowers bloom for weeks," she said, admiring the plant that had grown tall and strong on my windowsill. "Others bloom for just a moment, but the brief ones are often the most magnificent." That night I looked in the mirror again and saw something that would have surprised the woman I'd been 6 months earlier. I saw someone who was no longer waiting for someone else to decide she was worthwhile. I saw someone who was learning to bloom on her own timeline, in her own way, for her own reasons. The change was almost complete now. Not rage, not bitterness, not the need for revenge or vindication. Something much more powerful. The quiet confidence of a woman who'd remembered she didn't need anyone's permission to value herself. Soon, very soon, everyone else would see it too. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was repotting a small jade plant that had outgrown its container. My hands were dirty with soil. The morning light was streaming through windows I'd cleaned the day before, and I was completely absorbed in the simple pleasure of giving something room to grow when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. The number was Alejandro's, but I'd learned to live without the anxiety of wondering what he might want or need or demand. The woman I'd become over the past months didn't drop everything at the sound of his voice anymore, but something made me pick up. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the fact that it had been so long since he'd called that I wondered what could possibly motivate him to break his own silence. "Mom?" His voice was different, smaller somehow, stripped of the confident indifference that had characterized our last few conversations. I need to talk to you." I wiped my hands on a towel, taking my time. "I'm listening. Can I come over? I know things have been—" He struggled with words that had apparently never been difficult for him before. "Sarah left me." The old Maria would have immediately invited him over, would have started mentally preparing comfort food and gentle reassurances, would have pushed aside her own hurt to focus entirely on fixing his pain. But the woman I'd become simply said, "I'm sorry to hear that." The silence stretched between us. I could hear him breathing, probably waiting for me to ask questions, to offer solutions, to transform immediately back into the mother who existed solely to absorb his problems and reflect back only support and understanding. "Mom, did you hear me? Sarah left me. She took everything. The apartment, most of our stuff. She cleaned out our joint account. I don't have anywhere to go." "That sounds very difficult," I said, and meant it. I wasn't cruel enough to take pleasure in his pain, but I was no longer willing to make his problems my emergency. Another pause. "Can I come over, please? What do you need, Alejandro?" The question hung in the air. When was the last time I'd asked him what he actually needed instead of automatically providing whatever I thought he should want? When was the last time I'd made him articulate his requests instead of anticipating them? I need my mom," he said finally, and his voice cracked on the words. Something inside me softened, but it wasn't the complete surrender it would have been months earlier. "You can come over," I said, "but I'm not the same person I was the last time you were here." An hour later, he stood at my door looking like a stranger wearing my son's face, thinner than I remembered, with shadows under his eyes and an uncertainty in his posture that I'd never seen before. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and he carried a single duffel bag that apparently contained everything he'd been allowed to take from the life he'd built without me. "Thank you," he said as I let him in, and even those two words sounded different coming from him, grateful instead of entitled, uncertain instead of demanding. He stopped in the living room, looking around with obvious confusion. You changed things." The apartment did look different. Plants everywhere, pottery pieces on shelves, books stacked on surfaces that had been empty when he'd last been here. The furniture was arranged differently too, prioritizing light and air over television viewing. It looked like a home where someone actually lived, rather than a waiting room where someone sat hoping for visitors. "I've been learning new things," I said simply. "Would you like some coffee?" He nodded and followed me to the kitchen, where he sat at the table that had witnessed so many of our conversations over the years. But I didn't automatically start preparing his favorite breakfast or ask about his preferences. I made coffee the way I liked it and offered him a cup without asking how he wanted it prepared. "Mom, I know I've been distant lately," he began, his hands wrapped around the mug like he was trying to absorb its warmth. "I know I haven't been the best son." I sat across from him, not rushing to reassure him, not immediately forgiving him, just waiting to see what he'd actually come to say. Sarah's family, they made me feel like I needed to choose between them and you. Like staying close to you meant I wasn't really growing up, wasn't really becoming the man they thought I should be. His voice was quiet, ashamed. They kept saying things about how you were too involved, too needy, that healthy families gave their adult children space. I listened without defending myself, without explaining that I'd never asked for anything but the basic courtesy any human being deserved from someone they'd loved and supported. I'd learned that defending yourself to people who'd already decided you were wrong was a waste of energy better spent on your own growth. And I believed them, he continued. I started seeing everything you did through their eyes. Your calls became clingy. Your care packages became inappropriate. Your love became embarrassing. The honesty was brutal, but I appreciated it more than the lies and evasions he'd offered before. At least now I knew what I'd been fighting against. Not just his girlfriend, but an entire family system that had convinced him his mother's love was a character flaw he needed to overcome. And now? I asked. He looked up at me with eyes that were seeing me clearly for the first time in months. Now I realized that Sarah's family, they only loved the version of me that reflected well on them, the successful, polished version. When I lost my job last month, when the promotion fell through, when I started struggling, they disappeared. Sarah included. You lost your job? I asked, though not with the automatic concern that would have consumed me before. His employment status was his responsibility now, not mine. The company downsized, and Sarah, she said she couldn't be with someone who wasn't ambitious enough to land on his feet immediately. She said I was becoming too much like... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Like me? I supplied gently. He nodded, tears in his eyes. She said I was becoming too much like you, too willing to accept less than I deserved, too focused on feelings instead of success, too soft. I absorbed this information without the rage I might have felt months earlier. Sarah had inadvertently given me a gift. She'd shown my son exactly what conditional love looked like, how quickly people disappeared when you stopped being useful to their image of themselves. And what do you think about that? I asked. I think, he said slowly, that being like you isn't the insult she meant it to be. I think maybe you've been the only person in my life who loved me whether I was successful or struggling, whether I was making good choices or bad ones, whether I was someone to be proud of or someone who needed help. The words I'd waited months to hear should have felt triumphant. Instead, they felt sad, not because I wasn't happy to hear them, but because he'd had to lose everything else to remember something that should never have been in question. I'm not the same person I was when you left, I told him truthfully. I've learned to live without you. I've learned to be happy without your approval. I've learned to love myself the way I loved you, unconditionally, patiently, without expecting anything in return. He stared at me, confusion and something like fear crossing his features. What does that mean? It means I'm not going to stop my life to fix yours. It means I'm not going to sacrifice my peace to absorb your chaos. It means I love you, but I won't disappear into that love anymore. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before. Not empty or angry or desperate, just honest. Two people sitting across from each other, finally seeing clearly after months of illusion and denial. Can you forgive me? He asked finally. I looked at my son, really looked at him, not through the filter of desperate love or maternal obligation, but as one human being seeing another. He was hurt, alone, ashamed of choices that had cost him more than he'd expected. But he was also here, asking questions he should have asked months earlier, ready to hear answers he might not like. I already have, I said. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean going back to the way things were. Outside, rain had started falling, tapping against the windows with the patient rhythm of nature taking its time. My plants would drink well tonight, growing stronger in the storm. And maybe, if we were both willing to do the hard work of rebuilding rather than just returning, we could grow too. Alejandro stayed for 3 weeks, sleeping on my couch and slowly learning to navigate a relationship with the mother he'd thought he knew. The woman who'd once rearranged her entire life around his needs now had boundaries, schedules, and interests that didn't revolve around him. The first few days were the hardest for him. He kept waiting for me to transform back into the anxious, accommodating woman who'd made his problems disappear with love and sacrifice. Instead, He got someone who listened to his struggles with compassion but didn't immediately offer solutions, who cooked meals at regular times whether he was hungry or not, who went to pottery class on Thursday evenings regardless of whether he needed to talk. "Where are you going?" he asked the first Thursday, seeming genuinely confused that I might have plans that didn't include him. "Pottery class?" I said, gathering my bag and keys with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd learned to honor her commitments to herself. "There's leftover soup in the refrigerator if you get hungry, but I thought maybe we could talk tonight about everything." I paused at the door, seeing him clearly, a young man who'd been taught that his needs should always take priority, now confused by a mother who had other priorities too. "We can talk when I get back. The conversation will still be here in 3 hours. When I returned from class, he was sitting at my kitchen table with a notebook, writing. My pottery piece, a small vase that had emerged more beautiful than I'd expected, sat beside him, and he was studying it with the kind of attention I hadn't seen him give anything of mine in years. "You made this?" he asked, touching the rim gently. "I did. It's really good. I had no idea you were artistic." I sat down across from him, recognizing the moment for what it was. Not just a compliment about pottery, but an admission that he'd stopped seeing me as a complete person somewhere along the way, had reduced me to just the parts that served his needs. "I'm learning there are lots of things about myself I didn't know," I said. "Turns out, when you spend 28 years focused entirely on someone else's development, your own gets postponed, not canceled." He nodded slowly, writing something in his notebook. "What are you writing?" I asked. "A list," he said, showing me pages covered with his handwriting. "All the things I never knew about you, all the things I never asked, all the ways I made assumptions about who you were based on what I needed you to be." I read a few entries. "Mom wanted to travel, but spent vacation money on my summer camps. Mom gave up her college fund to help with my tuition. Mom worked double shifts every Christmas so I could have the presents I wanted. Mom never dated anyone seriously because I said I didn't like change." The list was long and detailed, evidence of a son finally seeing his mother as a person who'd had dreams and sacrifices and choices that had shaped her life as much as his. It was painful to read, but also validating, proof that the love I'd given hadn't been invisible, even when it had been taken for granted. "I thought love meant never having to think about the other person's needs," he said quietly. "I thought if you really loved someone, you'd just naturally want to give them everything they wanted without them having to ask or worry about the cost to you. That's not love," I said gently. "That's martyrdom, and it's not healthy for either person." Over the following weeks, we learned to have a different kind of relationship. He looked for jobs with genuine effort, not the entitled expectation that the right opportunity would simply present itself. He helped with housework without being asked, contributing to the space instead of just occupying it. He listened when I talked about my pottery class, my plants, my coworkers, showing interest in my life rather than just tolerance for it. Most importantly, he started asking questions. "What did you want to be when you were my age? What's the hardest thing about being a mother? If you could change anything about how you raised me, what would it be?" The answers weren't always comfortable for either of us. I told him about the dreams I'd postponed, the loneliness I'd felt during his teenage years when he'd started pulling away, the fear that had driven many of my choices, fear that if I wasn't perfect, if I wasn't selfless, if I wasn't constantly available, he'd leave me the way his father had. "I raised you to need me," I admitted one evening as we sat in my living room, surrounded by plants that had grown strong in the months since I'd started paying attention to my own needs too. "I thought if you were independent, you wouldn't want me around. So I made myself indispensable instead of just lovable. And I learned to take that for granted," he said. "I learned that love looked like someone disappearing themselves to make room for me." "Sarah wasn't wrong about everything," I said, surprised to find myself defending someone who'd hurt us both. "You did need to learn independence. You did need to stop relying on me to solve your problems. She just went about it the wrong way. She made me choose between loving you and becoming an adult," he said, like those were mutually exclusive. "They're not," I said firmly. "Healthy love grows stronger when both people are whole, not weaker." 3 weeks after he'd arrived on my doorstep, Alejandro found an apartment and a job in the same week. But instead of the desperate scramble it would have been months earlier, it felt like natural next steps for someone who'd learned to take responsibility for his own life. The night before he moved out, We sat on my couch, the same couch where I'd received his devastating text message, where I'd cried over his absence, where I'd slowly learned to live without him. "I'm scared," he admitted. "What if I mess up again? What if I make more bad choices? Then you'll learn from them," I said. "And you'll know that making mistakes doesn't make you unlovable. It makes you human." "Will you still be here?" he asked. And I heard in his voice the little boy who used to worry that I'd disappear while he was at school. "I'll be here," I promised. "But I'll be here living my own life, not waiting for you to live yours. The difference is that now you'll be visiting someone who's happy to see you because she wants to, not because she needs to." He moved out on a Saturday, taking only what belonged to him and leaving behind the neediness that had characterized our relationship for so long. We hugged goodbye, not with the desperate clinging of people afraid of separation, but with the confident affection of people who trusted their connection to survive distance and time. That evening, I sat in my quiet apartment with a cup of tea and my journal, writing about the strange completion I felt. Not because my son had returned to me, though I was grateful he had, but because I'd returned to myself. The hibiscus had bloomed again, 3 perfect flowers this time, their red petals bright against the green leaves. Mrs. Rodriguez knocked to admire them, bringing her granddaughter who wanted to learn about plants. "How do you make them so beautiful?" the little girl asked, touching the petals with careful fingers. "You give them what they need," I said, "but you don't try to control how they grow. You trust them to know what they're becoming." Later that week, Carmen came for lunch and spent 20 minutes staring at me before finally shaking her head in amazement. "I don't know how to explain it," she said, "but you look like yourself again, like the person you were before you forgot you existed." "I'm better than I was before," I corrected. "I'm who I always could have been if I'd had the courage to disappoint people who wanted me to stay small." Elena from pottery class invited me to display some of my pieces in a small gallery show. Nothing grand, just a local event showcasing student work. But when I saw my vases and bowls arranged on white pedestals with small cards bearing my name, I felt a pride that belonged entirely to me. Alejandro came to the show, bringing flowers and genuine enthusiasm for work he was seeing with new eyes. "I'm proud of you," he said, and for the first time in years, those words felt like a gift, rather than something I desperately needed to survive. "I'm proud of me too," I replied, and realized that was the difference. I no longer needed his pride to feel worthy of my own. 6 months later, I got a call from Sarah. She was struggling after her own life fell apart, looking for someone to blame or perhaps someone to understand her choices. I listened with the compassion I'd learned to extend even to people who'd hurt me, but without the need to fix her pain or take responsibility for her mistakes. "I never meant for things to go so far," she said. "I just wanted him to be more independent." "Independence and cruelty aren't the same thing," I told her gently. "Neither are love and control." After we hung up, I watered my plants, a collection that had grown to fill every sunny corner of my apartment, and thought about the lessons I'd learned about growth. Some things needed to be pruned to flourish. Some relationships needed to be restructured to survive. Some love needed to be redirected inward before it could flow outward in healthy ways. I'd learned that the opposite of selfless love wasn't selfish love. It was sustainable love. Love that honored both people's needs, that encouraged growth rather than dependence, that created space for both individuals to flourish. That night, I wrote in my journal, "I spent 28 years teaching my son that love meant sacrifice. It took losing him to learn that real love means 2 whole people choosing each other, not one person disappearing to make room for another." The woman who'd sat in this same spot months earlier, devastated by a text message that reduced her to nothing, was gone. In her place sat someone who'd learned the most important lesson of her life, that you can't love anyone well until you've learned to love yourself with the same fierce tenderness you've always given to others. I closed the journal and smiled at my reflection in the window, not because someone else had finally decided I was worthy of love, but because I'd finally decided it myself, and that, I'd learned, was the only approval that could never be taken away. The silence in my apartment wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility, of growth, of a woman who'd finally learned that she was worth the love she'd always been so eager to give away. Tomorrow would bring new conversations with Alejandro, new pottery projects, new flowers blooming on my windowsill. But tonight, I was complete all by myself, and that felt like the greatest victory of all.